Why 18th century sailors believed citrus could save them from scurvy. Chapter 1. The Endless Blue. In the middle of the 18th century, the age of sail was nearing its height. Great fleets set out from Europe in search of trade, conquest, and discovery, their sails swelling like pale clouds against the horizon. To stand on the deck of such a vessel was to be part of a grand undertaking, a venture measured not only in miles, but in months and years. Yet for all the majesty of their journeys, life aboard a ship was a constant negotiation with hardship. The decks were rarely dry. Salt spray clung to every rope and plank. Below, in the darkness of the hold, the air grew heavy with the mingled smells of pitch, damp timber, and barrels of preserved meat. It was in this confined world that scurvy would take hold. Most sailors never gave the disease much thought when they first stepped aboard. They had heard stories, of course. Old tales of men whose teeth loosened in their gums, whose skin broke into sores, who grew too weak to climb the rigging. But the accounts seemed almost like legends, cautionary tales told by veterans eager to impress green recruits. Yet within a few weeks of sailing beyond the coastlines, the fresh provisions began to vanish. Lettuce wilted, apples softened into bruised lumps, onions shriveled, caked into soil soaked with lime, salads shriveled to powder, poisoned eggs, broken beds, and turned to ashes by the time the river meadows had failed. Yet, within a few weeks of sailing beyond the coastlines, they had heard stories of captains whose bruised lumps, onions shriveled, onions flaked and caused them to sob to the sea, were turned to paint, bleaching, concrete, teeth, crucifixions, bodies. In their place came the staples of long voyages: salted beef, hardtack biscuits, dried peas. Water was stored in casks that soon tasted of mold. At first, no one thought these supplies could be dangerous. After all, they were the same foods sailors had carried for generations. But slowly, inevitably, something essential faded from the men's bodies. One by one, sailors began to notice small changes. Bruises appeared without injury. Old scars seemed to open again. The gums turned dark and tender. Some men lost the will to eat altogether, huddling in their hammocks, too weary to stand. Officers recorded these developments in logbooks with a quiet dread. Scurvy was not new to maritime life. Since the age of Columbus, captains had observed its terrible toll. In the 1490s, Vasco da Gama lost nearly two-thirds of his crew to it. Later voyages fared no better. Yet no one could agree on what caused it. Some thought scurvy came from foul air or from the dampness in the ship's timbers. Others blamed a deficiency of acids in the diet, though they could not say precisely what those acids were. In 1740, Commodore George Anson set sail with 8 ships to harass Spanish colonies in the Pacific. His expedition would become infamous not for its victories, but for its losses. Over 4 years, more than 1,800 men died, most not in battle, but from scurvy. The disease struck without pity. Men who had seemed fit only days before were reduced to shadows, unable to lift a cup of water. Among naval surgeons, there was no consensus on a cure. Some recommended vinegar, others tried elixirs made of sulfuric acid and herbs. A few insisted that fresh vegetables, particularly citrus fruits, could halt the disease. But in an age when evidence was fragmentary and superstition still mingled with science, such ideas rarely became policy. For ordinary sailors, the threat of scurvy was simply part of life at sea. They accepted the risk as they accepted storms and cannon fire. On long voyages, men would sometimes dream of gardens, of the tang of ripe lemons, of the crisp bite of an apple. These visions were private comforts, glimpses of a world beyond the ship's rail. And yet, even amid the suffering, small experiments were taking place. Some captains quietly ordered casks of lemon juice, doling it out when the crew began to weaken. A few recorded remarkable recoveries. But without systematic trials, these successes remained little more than anecdote. The knowledge was there, flickering at the edges of awareness like the green flash at sunset. What remained was the courage to test it, to trust observation over tradition. In time, the ships pressed on. The Atlantic gave way to the Caribbean, the Pacific, the endless blue that stretched farther than most men had ever imagined. For every sailor leaning against the rail, eyes fixed on the horizon, there was an unspoken hope that the voyage might end before scurvy took its toll. They could not have known that in a few short years, a Scottish surgeon named James Lind would gather enough evidence to prove what many had suspected, that a simple citrus fruit could save lives where every other remedy had failed. But in this moment, this chapter in the story, knowledge remained elusive. The holds were filled with barrels of salt beef and biscuit, the fresh stores long since consumed, and in the silence of the night watch, some men awoke to the dull ache in their limbs, the first sign that scurvy had come aboard. As the ship sailed on, the disease waited, patient as the sea itself. Chapter 2. The Weight of Tradition. On ships of the Royal Navy, discipline governed every waking hour. Bells marked time as precisely as any clock. The daily ration of food and drink was measured to the ounce, handed down in regulations that had changed little in a century. Sailors learned to trust in routine. At dawn, they scrubbed the decks until the planks gleamed pale and wet. At midday, they gathered in lines for their meals: salted pork, hardtack, sometimes a ladle of peas. In the afternoon, they repaired rigging or polished brass, and at sunset, hammocks were slung in rows along the gun decks. This rhythm offered comfort in a life otherwise ruled by chance. The sea might be calm one day and raging the next. Ships might sight friendly sails or hostile ones, but the ration, predictable, unchanging, was the anchor that held the crew to a sense of order. It was this very predictability that allowed scurvy to flourish. When a ship left port, its officers knew exactly how long the salted meat would last, how many barrels of biscuit were needed to feed the men to the next harbor. Fresh produce, if it came aboard at all, was considered a luxury to be consumed in the first week. After that, the hold became a place of dryness and salt, a sealed world where no living green thing remained. Some captains understood that this absence carried hidden dangers. They had seen scurvy destroy crews, had buried men at sea, wrapped in canvas, weighted with shot. A few older officers spoke of voyages where whole watch rotations had collapsed, leaving ships scarcely able to navigate home. And yet, when these stories were told, they were often spoken in the same tone as a tale of storms or shipwrecks, calamities to be endured, not prevented. The thought that scurvy might have a simple cause or a simple cure was too radical for most to entertain. Among the more curious minds of the age, theories abounded. Some physicians believed scurvy arose from putrefaction of the humors, a vague corruption of bodily fluids brought on by damp air. Others insisted it came from a lack of acidity in the diet. There were even those who thought melancholy and idleness could bring on the disease. In this confusion, each navy developed its own customs. The Dutch had long favored vinegar and sauerkraut. Now, presumably no one's envisioned a bad concept for association that somehow took vinegar and sauerkraut. The French experimented with lemon syrup. The British issued malt extract and a potent elixir called elixir of vitriol made with sulfuric acid, so corrosive it sometimes caused burns in the mouth. But none of these remedies was adopted consistently. No single authority had gathered enough proof to override centuries of habit. Below decks, the sailors themselves sometimes guessed more accurately than their superiors. A man who had survived earlier voyages might warn his messmates, "Eat what greens you can, if you find them," but such advice was rarely possible to follow. Once the ship passed beyond the reach of shore, there was nothing but the rations. As weeks turned into months, the first symptoms crept in. Gums that bled at the slightest touch, aches in the joints, bruises that spread under the skin like dark ink. At first, these signs were easily ignored. A sailor would laugh off the tenderness in his mouth, claiming he'd been struck by the boom. But soon, he found it painful to chew. He took longer to climb the rigging. When the boatswain called, His voice sounded very far away. Officers kept their ledgers of provisions. Surgeons noted each case in neat columns. The records survive today in archives, page after page of names, dates, and terse diagnoses. Scorbutus, the Latin word for scurvy. One such logbook belonged to a Scottish naval surgeon named James Lind. He was a quiet observer, trained to look for patterns. When he read those entries, hundreds of men sickened in the same way. He began to suspect that tradition itself was to blame. Still, on the ships that left Portsmouth or Deptford, little changed. The same casks were rolled into the holds. The same biscuits were stacked in neat pyramids. The same salted pork was hoisted aboard by sweating stevedores. Each new crew believed that they would fare better, that their voyage would end before scurvy arrived. And for a while, it often seemed true. The men sang as they worked, they stood watch under brilliant stars, they dreamed of prizes and adventure. But the disease waited, patient and invisible. It would bide its time until the last apple was gone, until the last onion sprouted mold. Then it would begin its slow harvest. No one yet understood how a barrel of lemons could have saved them. No one imagined that something so bright, so fragrant, could carry the power to restore life to failing bodies. For now, tradition held sway, stronger than curiosity, stronger than doubt. And on every deck, beneath the creak of the rigging and the slap of waves, the silence of scurvy gathered its strength. Silence of scurvy gathered its strength. Chapter 3. The Scottish surgeon James Lind was born in Edinburgh in 1716, in a country where medicine was evolving from folk remedies to a more disciplined science. As a young man, he apprenticed in the Royal Navy, learning the art of treating wounds, fevers, and the thousand afflictions that haunted life at sea. His early service took him across the Atlantic to the West Indies, where he observed firsthand how scurvy ravaged crews. It struck without warning, often beginning with mere lassitude, a dull fatigue that sailors blamed on heat or boredom. Soon, though, the disease revealed its true cruelty. Teeth loosened and fell, old scars reopened, weeping as if the body itself had forgotten how to heal. Legs swelled, knees locked. Men who once scrambled up the ratlines like cats now struggled to stand. Lind kept careful notes. He was not the first physician to suspect that diet held the key. Yet he had something many of his colleagues lacked: the determination to test ideas instead of repeating inherited wisdom. In 1747, during a posting aboard HMS Salisbury, he decided to run an experiment. It was a small study, almost humble in scale, but it would become one of the most important clinical trials in medical history. 12 sailors suffering from scurvy were divided into 6 pairs. Each pair received a different treatment. Some were given cider, others vinegar. Some swallowed doses of sulfuric acid or seawater, and one pair received a ration of 2 oranges and a lemon each day. Within days, the improvement in the citrus group was undeniable. The 2 men recovered so swiftly that they were returned to duty before the others showed any sign of progress. This process, Lind recorded the results in detail, noting that fresh citrus had restored health where every other remedy failed. But the story did not end there. Despite the clarity of his findings, Lind was cautious. Like many scientists of his time, he was reluctant to discard all established theories. In his 1753 treatise, A Treatise of the Scurvy, he laid out the results of his experiment, but also continued to discuss air, moisture, and other possible causes. His writing was thorough but complex, and many readers overlooked the simple conclusion: citrus fruits could cure scurvy. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy remained slow to act. Logistics, cost, and inertia all played a part. Lemons were expensive and perishable. Vinegar and malt were cheaper and easier to store. And so, for decades after Lind's experiment, thousands more sailors would suffer and die needlessly. Yet Lind's work planted a seed of change. Other surgeons began to replicate his observations. Captains who had witnessed scurvy firsthand grew more willing to experiment. Word spread through mess decks and wardrooms that there might be a reliable cure waiting in the holds of ships, if only it could be provided. Outside the Navy, too, the study caught the interest of physicians who dreamed of a more scientific medicine. In an era when many still believed in balancing humors and expelling corruptions, Lind's careful trial pointed to a future in which observation, comparison, and evidence could guide treatment. Lind himself was a modest man, content to return to civilian practice in Edinburgh. He never lived to see his findings fully embraced by the Admiralty. But he did witness the gradual shift in attitudes, like a tide that retreats for years before flooding in all at once. Today, his experiment aboard the Salisbury is often cited as the dawn of modern clinical research. It proved that even in the cramped, unsanitary confines of an 18th century warship, it was possible to test a hypothesis systematically and learn something that could save countless lives. Imagine, for a moment, that small sickbay aboard the Salisbury. A dim space, smelling of tar and seawater, where a surgeon carefully measured each man's portion of citrus. In that quiet corner of the ship, something profound was unfolding, a challenge to centuries of tradition. It was not a discovery born of grandeur or authority. It was a discovery born of observation, care, and a simple question: what if we tried something different? And so, while the rest of the ship went about its routines, sailors mending watch, the cure for scurvy took shape, unheralded, beneath the creak of timbers and the sighing of the wind. Chapter 4. A Ship Called Experiment. Long before citrus became the Navy's standard cure, a few captains took the lessons of James Lind to heart. Among them was Captain James Cook, whose voyages in the Pacific would become legendary, not just for their discoveries, but for the health of his crews. In 1768, when Cook prepared to lead the Endeavour on her first great circumnavigation, he faced the same problems that had plagued generations of sailors: long months at sea, unreliable supplies, and the constant threat of disease. But Cook was determined to try something new. He stocked his hold with sauerkraut, malt, and lime juice. He did not fully understand why some of these foods worked, nor did he have Lind's clinical certainty. Yet he believed, as Lind had shown, that diet was the best hope against scurvy. In this, he was remarkably ahead of his time. Many of his contemporaries still clung to the old idea that scurvy came from bad air or dampness. But Cook made diet a priority, compelling his sailors to eat foods they might otherwise have refused. His methods could be severe. When the crew resisted sauerkraut, he ordered it served to the officers first, creating the impression that it was a privilege rather than a punishment. Soon, the men followed suit, and the barrels were emptied willingly. Cook's approach combined practicality with a shrewd understanding of human nature. He knew that even the best provisions were useless if men refused to eat them. He suffered. This was an illness that men adapted to without opposition and refused to eat them. By the time Endeavour returned to England after nearly 3 years at sea, Cook had lost remarkably few sailors to scurvy. His success did not immediately change naval policy. Admirals and politicians were slow to endorse anything that seemed novel. Yet among the men who served under Cook, the lesson was unforgettable. They had seen how simple foods could preserve strength and spirit when nothing else could. Meanwhile, in the naval hospitals of Britain, Lind's writings circulated in quiet circles. Surgeons debated the merits of lemon versus lime, fresh fruit versus preserved juice. Some insisted that only fresh citrus retained the vital acidity. Others argued that distillation or storage methods were enough to rob the fruit of its healing power. Each small trial, each careful observation, added weight to the idea that scurvy could be prevented. The human cost of delay, however, remained staggering. Expeditions to the Arctic and the South Seas still set sail with little more than salted meat and biscuit. Journal entries from these voyages record the same grim litany: swollen gums, dark bruises, slow decline. Even when captains knew about citrus, they often lacked the authority or resources to supply it. But the tide of change was building. The reports of Cook's expeditions could not be ignored forever. A ship returning to port with most of her crew alive was a powerful argument. Merchants and insurers took note as well. A healthy crew meant faster voyages and fewer payouts. It was in this atmosphere, a mix of skepticism, curiosity, and necessity, that the Royal Navy began to consider a more systematic approach. In 1795, almost half a century after Lynn's first experiment, the Admiralty at last issued orders to supply lemon juice as a daily ration on all ships bound for long voyages. The instructions were specific. The juice must be fresh, stored in well-sealed containers, and issued daily with a measure of sugar to improve the taste. Within a few years, scurvy, which had killed tens of thousands over centuries, nearly vanished from the Navy's ranks. In short, everything sugar had been doing bad had been doing good. By helping to flush out the ship's lungs, nearly vanished from the Navy's rank. The transformation was so sudden that some observers could scarcely believe it. Where once a ship returned home with half her crew lost, she now arrived with men fit and ready. Yet the old stories did not fade overnight. Many sailors continued to view citrus with superstition. They had grown up believing that scurvy was a punishment, a curse that struck without warning. The idea that a simple lemon could save them seemed almost too good to be true. Imagine for a moment those first barrels of lemon juice hoisted into the holds of a man of war. The liquid sloshing in casks, the purser measuring out each ration, the men tasting the sharp, unfamiliar flavor. In those small gestures lay the triumph of observation over dogma. The work of a Scottish surgeon and a resolute captain had become the policy of an empire. As the Navy adapted, the lessons spread. Merchant ships began to carry citrus. Explorers in the Arctic and Antarctic packed crates of lemons alongside their charts and instruments. Even land armies experimented with the same rations, hoping to spare their troops the slow decay of scurvy. The story of citrus and scurvy was not merely a medical tale. It was a testament to the power of evidence, to the idea that knowledge, once proven, can change the fate of countless lives. And so, the ship called Experiment sailed on, not just as a vessel of timber and sail, but as a symbol of a turning point in human understanding. Chapter 5. The Reluctant Admiralty. While captains like Cook had embraced the idea that diet could conquer scurvy, the Admiralty in London remained cautious. In the late 18th century, the Royal Navy was the largest and most complex fighting force the world had ever seen. Change, in such an institution, moved at the pace of politics and paperwork. The Admiralty's boardrooms were far removed from the reality of life at sea. There, men in fine coats reviewed ledgers and dispatches by candlelight. They debated funding, ship construction, and discipline. They measured risk in columns of figures rather than the faces of dying sailors. Scurvy was recognized as a problem, but it was also accepted as an inevitability. After all, hadn't it always been so? From the days of Drake and Hawkins to the wars against France, sailors had succumbed by the thousands. There had been 5 whole weeks of despair that had been divided every night in fear and hope. And then to suggest that something as simple as citrus could prevent such losses sounded dangerously close to fantasy. Yet reports continued to arrive. Captains returning from long voyages brought tales of crews kept strong by lemon juice or sauerkraut. Surgeons presented case studies and journals filled with careful observations. Still, the Admiralty hesitated. There were practical obstacles. Supply. Where could enough citrus be obtained to serve an entire navy? Preservation. How could juice be stored without spoiling on long voyages? Cost. Lemons and limes were expensive, especially when Britain was at war. Skepticism. Many senior officers had built their careers on older doctrines. Changing course felt like admitting they had been wrong all along. In 1794, however, circumstances forced the Admiralty's hand. Britain's navy was expanding to fight revolutionary France. Ships were needed to blockade ports, escort convoys, and carry troops. Losing thousands of sailors to disease threatened the entire war effort. In this climate of urgency, the the voices of reform grew harder to ignore. The reports from captains like Cook and surgeons like Lind were revisited with fresh eyes. And in 1795, nearly 50 years after Lind's first trial, the Admiralty issued an order that would transform maritime health. Every seaman on long voyages was to receive a daily ration of lemon juice. To modern readers, this may sound like a simple directive, but at the time it required a vast reorganization of naval supply chains. Merchants were contracted to import and process citrus in enormous quantities. Coopers built specialized barrels lined with tin or glass to slow spoilage. Pursers were instructed on how to mix juice with sugar and serve it as a daily dose. Some officers objected, arguing that lemons were a costly indulgence. Others worried that the juice would ferment or turn foul. But the first ships dispatched under the new orders quickly silenced the critics. When HMS Suffolk returned from India after a voyage of more than a year, she had not lost a single man to scurvy. The news spread rapidly through the Navy. Captains who had once doubted now demanded their share of the citrus ration. Sailors, too, began to trust the routine. Each morning, the purser measured out the portion, roughly an ounce, into wooden cups. Men sipped the tart liquid with a grimace or a shrug. Some joked that it was Admiralty grog, a bitter medicine, but all understood that it was preferable to the swollen gums and blackened skin of scurvy. In this way, a change that had once seemed impossible became the new orthodoxy. Ships departed with holds stocked not only with gunpowder and biscuit, but with the means to keep men alive. The broader impact was immediate and profound. Ships could stay at sea longer without needing to make port for fresh provisions. Blockades tightened, voyages accelerated. The Royal Navy's logistical power grew. Beyond strategy, there was also a quiet revolution in morale. For the first time, sailors felt they had a defense against an old enemy. The fear that had haunted every long voyage receded. Men who might once have resigned themselves to decline now looked forward to returning home strong. Of course, citrus did not end all suffering. Ships remained dangerous places, full of accidents, infections, and privation, but scurvy, the scourge of centuries, had been largely banished. Imagine the scene in a royal dockyard, as barrels of lemon juice were hoisted aboard a newly commissioned ship of the line. Officers inspected manifests, sailors carried crates, coopers' apprentices hammered lids into place. No fanfare marked this moment. There was no parade or proclamation. Yet it was a triumph, one that had taken half a century of patient observation, stubborn advocacy, and quiet courage. When the Suffolk set sail again, her decks crowded with men in blue jackets. The sailors carried with them not just weapons and supplies, but the proof that knowledge could change the course of history. Chapter 6. Lemons and Limes. Once the Admiralty ordered lemon juice as the official ration, a curious question arose. Which citrus worked best? James Lind's original experiment had used both oranges and lemons, but as supplies scaled up for an entire navy, practical considerations took precedence over laboratory precision. Lemons were imported from the Mediterranean, particularly from Sicily and southern Spain, where British merchants struck deals to purchase them in bulk. Yet, over time, limes began to replace lemons in many shipments. Limes grew plentiful in British Caribbean colonies, such as Dominica and Montserrat. They were cheaper and easier to transport under contracts favorable to the Crown. Thus, without much fanfare, the Royal Navy shifted from the bright, familiar lime to the smaller, greener lime. Sailors took to calling their daily ration simply lime juice, and soon they were nicknamed limeys, a word that persists even now. Few aboard ship understood the subtle difference between lemons and limes. Even fewer realized that limes, particularly the West Indian varieties, contained less vitamin C than their Mediterranean cousins. The shift in supply was driven by logistics and imperial trade priorities rather than science. For a time, it didn't matter much. The Royal Navy still kept men healthier than ever before. With any citrus, scurvy's worst ravages diminished. Prince Scurvy's. Ravash Palm Lake, Ravash Palm River, Ravache Palm Cove. Ever since the flooding of the South Channel, Lake Pikes pose streets, carts, rain, pits, snow, a rapid flood, a dead palm spring, and multiple years of declining growth. For the next decade, the lake palm scurvy prevailed, even making highways impossible. The sight of bleeding gums and purple bruises grew rare on the long voyages to India, China, or Australia. Still, there were occasional flare-ups of the disease. Captains sometimes wondered why scurvy returned when all the regulations had been followed, but the cause remained obscure. No one yet knew about ascorbic acid, or its vulnerability to heat and air. By the early 1800s, however, confidence in the citrus ration was strong. Ship's logs recorded the near disappearance of scurvy as a cause of mortality. For the first time in naval history, commanders could plan campaigns without fearing that disease would decimate their crews before a single shot was fired. One of the most celebrated examples came during the Napoleonic Wars, when Admiral Lord Nelson blockaded Toulon for years on end. His fleet remained at sea month after month, living on salted meat, biscuit, and daily rations of lime juice. Though many men fell to wounds or fever, scurvy was not the foe it had once been. In 1805, when Nelson prepared for the Battle of Trafalgar, his fleet was the healthiest the Royal Navy had ever fielded. Sailors still grumbled about their diet, still dreamed of fresh bread and ale, but they no longer resigned themselves to the slow decay of scurvy. Beyond Britain, other nations took note. The French Navy experimented with fresh produce but struggled with supply lines disrupted by blockade. The Spanish and Portuguese fleets made use of local citrus when available, but never adopted the system as thoroughly as the British. Meanwhile, in Britain's growing merchant marine, the lesson spread gradually. Trading companies, wary of the extra cost, were slower to provide citrus. But the evidence mounted. Ships that carried lemon or lime juice returned with healthier crews. Insurers began to offer better terms to captains who provisioned properly. In time, the practice became standard across the commercial fleets. Even whaling ships, among the most isolated vessels in the world, began to carry casks of citrus. These long voyages, sometimes lasting 3 or 4 years, had once been notorious for scurvy's toll. But with better provisioning, the risks fell dramatically. Back on land, physicians and scientists debated what precisely gave citrus its power. Some believed it was acidity. Others speculated it was the vegetable juices that purified the blood. It would be more than a century before the discovery of vitamin C provided the definitive explanation. Yet the sailors did not need to know the chemistry. They only knew that the daily ration worked. The bitter taste, chased down with a swallow of grog or water, became part of the rhythm of the sea. Imagine the ritual: the purser unlocking the storeroom, dipping his ladle into a barrel lined with tin or glass, the liquid splashing into wooden cups. Sailors gathering in line, each waiting for the tang that meant health. It was a small ceremony, repeated on every ship in every ocean, a quiet testament to observation, trial, and the determination to spare men needless suffering. And so, in the holds of British ships, a modest green fruit took its place among the tools of Chapter 7. The Skeptics Ashore. Even as the Royal Navy transformed its provisioning, skepticism persisted among physicians and officials ashore. Some doctors in Britain's hospitals doubted that scurvy could be prevented by diet alone. In their view, the disease was a product of deep constitutional imbalances, bad air, melancholy, or the invisible corruption of the blood. Medical schools still taught theories inherited from Galen and Paracelsus. These ancient authorities insisted that all illness came from disturbances in the body's humors. Though these ideas were losing ground, they remained embedded in the minds of many respected practitioners. Thus, when naval surgeons returned with reports of lemon juice's power, some colleagues received the news coolly. A cure so simple, so ordinary, seemed implausible. In medical journals and learned societies, papers were published debating whether citrus juice was genuinely curative or merely a temporary stimulant. Part of the difficulty lay in the lack of clear biochemical explanation. No one had identified vitamin C or understood the body's need for it. Observations could prove that lemons worked, but they could not yet explain why. Even among those who believed, confusion reigned about how best to prepare and store the juice. Some advocated boiling it into syrup, assuming the essential properties would remain. Others argued that only fresh fruit retained the vegetable acid necessary to restore health. Meanwhile, in Britain's ports, suppliers saw opportunity. Contractors offered all manner of preserved citrus products: candied peel, concentrated extracts, barrels of fermented lime juice. Not all of it was effective, but the rush to profit often drowned out the more cautious voices. To the men actually serving at sea, these debates mattered little. What mattered was the evidence of their own bodies. Sailors who had endured scurvy on earlier voyages now returned home stronger, their limbs intact, their gums sound. In the taverns of Portsmouth and Plymouth, tales of the miraculous lemon ration spread. New recruits heard stories of voyages lasting a year or more without a single case of scurvy. Though the grog still flowed and the food remained plain, the fear that had once haunted every crossing receded into memory. On land, however, physicians in hospitals continued to treat scurvy in soldiers and the urban poor. Among prisoners and laborers, populations that rarely saw fresh produce, the disease remained stubbornly present. Here, too, lemon and lime might have helped, but supplies were costly, and the will to reform was slow to take root. Aboard merchant ships, progress was patchy. Captains who traded in distant colonies sometimes invested in citrus, recognizing its value. Others regarded it as an expense to be cut when profits were thin. Insurance companies eventually applied pressure, offering favorable rates to ship owners who carried proper rations. Still, the skeptics endured, penning pamphlets and articles questioning whether the naval successes were exaggerated. Some claimed the improvement came from better hygiene or shorter voyages, not diet. Others insisted scurvy was primarily a disease of the mind, brought on by boredom, fear, and longing. It would take decades before the scientific community reached consensus. The tide of opinion moved slowly, just as it had in the Admiralty's halls. Yet in this period of uncertainty, the sailors themselves knew what they had seen. They had watched the sick revive after a few days of citrus. They had carried their comrades half dead to the sick bay, only to see them walk back on deck, steady and whole, after a regimen of lemon juice. Those memories carried more weight than any treatise or debate. They formed a kind of living testimony that no argument could erase. Over time, the experience of thousands of men wore down resistance. When enough ships returned safely, when enough captains swore by their casks of limes, the skeptics found themselves increasingly isolated. And so, a quiet revolution unfolded, a shift in belief driven not by theory, but by practice. In the end, the truth of citrus did not triumph through persuasion alone. It triumphed because it worked. Chapter 8: The Chemistry of Survival. As the 19th century progressed, new tools began to enter the service of science. The age of alchemy was ending, replaced by an age of measurement. Weighing scales grew precise, microscopes revealed the unseen, and in quiet laboratories, early chemists, still called natural philosophers by some, started to break down substances into their elemental parts. Among these thinkers were men like Humphrey Davy, who experimented with gases, and Joseph Priestley, who investigated airs and the nature of combustion. Their work had little to do with scurvy at first glance, but their questions, what is the body made of? What does it need to live? Set the stage for a deeper understanding of nutrition. By the 1840 Essen, 1850 Essen, scientists in Europe began to analyze food in new ways. They learned that certain substances, proteins, fats, carbohydrates, served as fuel for the body, but even diets rich in these basics could still fail to prevent disease. Something was missing, something small and essential. Still, no one could quite name what it was. Doctors continued to see scurvy in prisons, in orphanages, and during long Arctic expeditions. One report from a British polar voyage in the 1850s described men growing weak despite eating hearty stews. The problem, the surgeon suspected, was that the meat and vegetables had been boiled for hours, destroying whatever mysterious property they once held. It was a clue, though no one yet recognized it. Meanwhile, in naval stores, lemon juice remained standard. But to extend its shelf life, suppliers often boiled or distilled it. The resulting product lasted longer but was less effective. Cases of scurvy began to reappear, especially on ships that sailed far from tropical ports. The lime juice used in the British Navy came mostly from the West Indies by then, particularly from Montserrat and Dominica. Unlike Sicilian lemons, these limes had lower vitamin C content to begin with. When processed through heat, they lost even more potency. Chapter 9. The Arctic Lessons. While the Royal Navy had mostly conquered scurvy in its global voyages, explorers pushing into the Arctic found themselves grappling with the disease all over again. The far north presented challenges no Mediterranean fleet had ever faced. Bitter cold made it difficult to store fresh provisions. Months of darkness stretched morale thin. Hunting sometimes yielded meat but little in the way of plants. In the early 1800s, expeditions in search of the Northwest Passage suffered greatly. William Parry's voyages in the 1820s carried lemon juice, and though it helped, supplies often ran out before the ice broke. His men learned to watch one another for early signs: stiff joints, spongy gums, and to ration precious stores until the thaw. Later expeditions, including Sir John Franklin's ill-fated journey in 1845, again confronted the limits of preservation. The Franklin expedition took with it nearly 8,000 tins of preserved food, including lemon juice, but the canning process of the day often destroyed vitamin C. Even with the lessons of the Navy, no one fully grasped how fragile the cure could be. In 1850, rescue missions searching for Franklin's lost crews found abandoned camps. Among the wreckage were empty tins and diaries describing sickness creeping over strong men. They had perished in a landscape of ice, their last defenses against scurvy weakened by ignorance and technology not yet ready to preserve the cure. These tragedies underscored the difference between knowledge and implementation. The Royal Navy's success relied on routine resupply and careful handling. In the Arctic, where no new provisions could be gathered for months or years, the smallest error could be fatal. Nevertheless, explorers persevered. Each generation carried forward scraps of wisdom. By the late 1800s, some learned to supplement their diets with fresh meat from seals and caribou, unknowingly gaining vitamin C. Inuit guides taught them that raw liver and blubber kept them strong through the longest winter. These lessons were slow to spread, but eventually polar expeditions adapted. Fresh or lightly cooked meat replaced part of the old reliance on tinned rations. Citrus remained important, but explorers finally understood that survival in the Arctic demanded more than sealed crates. Meanwhile, in the public imagination, scurvy retained its old mystique. Newspapers described it as a curse of remoteness, a punishment for human ambition. To readers in London or New York, it seemed a disease from another world, afflicting men who dared venture where no civilization could follow. But the Arctic was only the starkest example. Scattered records showed scurvy among emigrants crossing the American plains, among gold seekers in Australia, and among soldiers besieged in Crimea. Wherever humans relied too long on preserved food, the same slow decay took hold. It was not until the early 20th century, when vitamin C was isolated and understood, that the last shadows of mystery finally lifted. Doctors realized that the problem was not remoteness itself, but the lack of this fragile nutrient. Imagine the relief of later explorers, men like Roald Amundsen, who knew precisely how to prevent scurvy. No longer did they have to gamble on untested methods or luck. They could plan with certainty, adding raw meat and fresh citrus whenever possible. In time, the Arctic became not just a place of tragedy, but a proving ground for knowledge. What had once been an arena of suffering grew into a testament to the stubborn drive to learn and adapt. When ships returned home, weathered, ice-scarred, but with their crews mostly intact, their success demonstrated how far the understanding of scurvy had come. No longer a curse, it had become a challenge that skill and preparation could meet. And so, from the frozen edges of the map, another chapter in the story of citrus and survival was written. One that reminded the world that progress was never as swift as discovery, and that truth, once glimpsed, required courage and discipline to apply. Chapter 10. Lived on salted beef, hard biscuit, and dried peas. If a shipmaster wished to provide fresh provisions, he paid for them himself. Insurance companies began to notice the contrast. Navy ships returned with healthy crews, while merchantmen often limped into port with men too weak to work. Underwriters quietly began adjusting premiums, offering better terms to owners who could prove they carried lemon or lime juice. Still, the change was gradual. Some shipmasters clung to old beliefs, that scurvy was caused by bad water or melancholy. Others resented any suggestion they were responsible for their crew's health beyond the bare minimum. For sailors, life under the merchant flag remained precarious. One season, they might sign onto a ship provisioned with care. Another, they would find themselves rationed to crumbs of stale biscuit and brackish water. Slowly, however, stories spread among the men. Veterans of the Navy who had tasted daily citrus knew the difference. They carried tales of captains who brought them home strong. At tavern tables and boarding houses, they swapped warnings about which owners cared for their crews and which did not. Public attention grew in the 1830s and 1840s as newspapers began to report on voyages gone wrong. Inquests into the deaths of sailors revealed the same litany of symptoms: swollen gums, foul breath, wounds that refused to heal. Journalists condemned the indifference of shipping companies who refused to spend a few extra pounds on lemons. A few influential shipowners, determined to avoid both tragedy and bad publicity, began to supply their vessels with preserved juice. At first, this was seen as an experiment, one more expense in a risky business. But as their ships began to return with fitter crews, profits increased. Sailors worked faster and longer when they were healthy. By the mid-19th century, it was no longer a mark of extravagance to carry citrus. It was a sign of competence. Apprentices and young officers learned to respect the small casks in the hold, understanding that discipline and prudence extended beyond the rigging and sails. Some merchants went further still. On lines that carried emigrants to Australia, shipmasters stocked crates of fresh potatoes and onions, more durable than citrus but still containing enough vitamin C to ward off disease. These small adjustments saved lives. One of the most influential cases came in 1856, when the Oliver Lang, a large emigrant ship, crossed from Liverpool to Melbourne. The voyage lasted over 100 days. The captain had insisted on ample fresh produce and a daily citrus ration, and when the ship arrived, almost every passenger disembarked in good health. Newspapers praised the success, contrasting it with the horror stories of other ships where scurvy still killed by the dozens. Insurance underwriters seized the moment, reducing premiums further for ships with documented supplies. By the 870s, citrus was almost universally adopted in long-haul merchant shipping. The slow process of economic incentive and social pressure had accomplished what no single decree could enforce. Imagine the scene aboard a clipper bound for San Francisco. Sailors coiling ropes as the purser unlocked the citrus cask, a ladle scraping wood, the sharp scent rising in the damp air, each man stepping forward to drink, perhaps complaining about the taste but knowing he would stay strong. It was a small ritual, born of generations of hard lessons. Meanwhile, medical journals began to catch up. Doctors published papers showing that scurvy could be cured reliably by raw potatoes, onions, fresh cabbage, and citrus. Though they still could not identify the chemical reason, the consensus finally solidified. Diet, not miasma, held the key. In the end, it was not only sailors who benefited. Emigrants, soldiers, explorers, and prisoners all eventually reaped the fruits of this knowledge. Where fresh provisions could be carried, they were. Where they could not, preserved citrus was a lifeline. The last strongholds of scurvy's superstition fell one by one, not through sudden revelation, but through the quiet accumulation of thousands of lives saved. Yet few in the Admiralty saw the problem. The Navy had defeated scurvy, they believed. The return of occasional cases was blamed on other factors: poor discipline, spoiled provisions, and the climate. By the late 1800s, scurvy had become a mystery again. Then, in the first years of the 20th century, a new generation of scientists approached the problem with sharper tools. Researchers in Hungary, the Netherlands, and England began to suspect that certain diseases came from the absence, not the presence, of specific substances. These substances didn't fit the older categories of protein or fat. They were something else entirely. In 1907, Norwegian researchers Axel Holst and Theodor Frolic made a breakthrough using guinea pigs. They discovered that these animals, like humans, could not produce their own vitamin C. When fed a diet lacking in fresh foods, the animals developed symptoms identical to scurvy. When given lemon juice, they recovered. It was the first conclusive experimental model of the disease. The missing substance, eventually named ascorbic acid from as and scorbutus, was isolated in 1932 by Hungarian chemist Albert Szent-Györgyi. That year, the modern science of vitamins was born. Suddenly, all the mysteries of the past began to make sense. Why did lemon juice work better than vinegar? Why did fresh citrus cure scurvy but boiled juice sometimes failed? Why did the disease reappear when rations were improperly stored? The answers lay in the delicate molecule of vitamin C, easily destroyed by heat, air, and time. In the wake of this discovery, nutrition science blossomed. Governments revised military and civilian rations. Food manufacturers began adding vitamins to bread, milk, and cereal. Vitamin C became available in tablets and powders, no longer dependent on trade routes or growing seasons. And scurvy, once the terror of the seas, was reduced to a footnote in medical textbooks. But even as science finally explained what sailors had known through experience, the old story still mattered. It had taken centuries for trial, error, and observation to reveal what could have been lost forever. In theory, Lin's oranges, Cook's sauerkraut, and the Limey's daily ration had all pointed toward a truth too small to see, until someone finally saw it. Empire no less essential than compass, sextant, or cannon. End of section 3. Chapter 11. As Britain's empire expanded in the 19th century, the fight against scurvy followed every shipping lane. From the Caribbean to India, from Australia to Hong Kong, naval and merchant ships spread not only goods and soldiers, but also knowledge, sometimes imperfect, sometimes hard-won, about how to prevent the disease. In colonial ports, local suppliers adapted to the new demand. In Calcutta, merchants stocked barrels of preserved lime juice alongside rice and salt beef. In Cape Town, ship chandlers offered casks of pickled cabbage and crates of oranges for vessels rounding the Cape of Good Hope. This commerce was more than a logistical convenience. It was a sign that a once mysterious ailment had been transformed into something predictable and, in theory, avoidable. Still, implementation varied widely. Some shipmasters resented being told how to provision. Others viewed citrus as a mark of modern professionalism. Port officials tried to standardize practices, issuing health regulations that recommended or required fresh vegetables and lemon juice. When the East India Company still held power, its directors recognized that scurvy could devastate not only military expeditions, but also profitable cargo voyages. The company began offering incentives to captains who returned with healthy crews. A shipment of spices or tea was worth far more if the sailors were strong enough to unload it quickly. In Australia, where the long voyages often lasted 100 days or more. Surgeons were appointed to each ship, tasked with monitoring the diet and insisting that prisoners and crew alike receive citrus or fresh produce. Reports from these voyages filled company archives with precise statistics: how many men fell ill, how many recovered, what provisions were carried. Some surgeons grew famous for their diligence. One, Dr. William Redfern, became respected for his meticulous records and his insistence that no voyage need end in disaster if fresh rations were properly distributed. Yet even as the British improved their practices, other colonial powers lagged behind. French, Dutch, and Spanish ships sometimes continued to rely on vinegar and discipline alone. In these fleets, scurvy outbreaks remained common, reinforcing the Royal Navy's belief that its methods were superior. The spread of citrus was not simply a humanitarian effort, it was an expression of imperial reach. To supply lemon juice on such a scale required global networks. Mediterranean orchards, Caribbean plantations, shipping contracts, and cooperages to build barrels. The vast machinery of empire made it possible. Meanwhile, in Britain's ports, public awareness continued to grow. Pamphlets warned emigrants to ask what provisions their ship carried. Newspapers published grim accounts of voyages that ended in mass graves. Over time, no respectable captain wished to be known as the master of a scurvy ship. Among sailors themselves, the daily ritual became almost invisible. A routine part of life, like grog or hardtack. New recruits learned to swallow their ration without complaint. Old hands remembered the days when it had been otherwise. Imagine a ship departing Liverpool in 1870, the dockside chaos of cargo loading, the calls of stevedores and chandlers, the final farewells. As the tide turned, the vessel slipped past the breakwaters, bound for Bombay or Sydney. In the hold, barrels of lime juice sat neatly lashed, as essential to the voyage as sails or charts. On deck, no one paused to celebrate the small miracle. Yet that quiet preparation meant that, weeks later, when the equatorial heat grew suffocating and provisions dwindled, the men would not fall to the same fate as their ancestors. By the end of the century, the colonial routes had become arteries not only of trade, but of public health. Ships that once carried scurvy across oceans now carried its cure. Once again, commerce might help people detox from scurvy, but their overdose of scarman couldn't comfort the sickness on its own. Now, commerce might help people detox from scurvy. Now commerce might help people detox from scurvy, but their overdose of scarman couldn't comfort the sickness on its own. Now, commerce might help people detox from scurvy, but it had no effect. More than a decade later, the colonial routes had become arteries to accompany the and in this unassuming transformation lay a lesson. Sometimes the most important revolutions happen not in the heat of battle or the glare of discovery, but in the slow, stubborn refinement of practice. Chapter 12. The Polar Expeditions Revisited. As the 19th century closed and the 20th dawned, a new generation of explorers turned their gaze toward the poles. The age of empire had become an age of scientific ambition. Men now set out not merely to map or claim territory, but to test the limits of human endurance. Among these pioneers were Fridtjof Nansen, Robert Falcon Scott, Roald Amundsen, and Ernest Shackleton. Their journeys into the Arctic and Antarctic combined the highest ideals of discovery with the harshest risks of deprivation. By this era, the role of fresh food in preventing scurvy was widely accepted. Naval manuals prescribed lemon or lime juice, fresh meat when possible, and an awareness that preserved rations alone could not sustain health indefinitely. Yet even with this knowledge, polar explorers found themselves confronted by the disease again and again. In 1893, Nansen's ship Fram sailed farther north than any vessel before it. Nansen had studied naval accounts carefully. He brought preserved lime juice, but he also relied on fresh-killed polar bear and walrus meat, following the practices of Inuit hunters. His crew remained healthy, a testament to the power of combining science with local knowledge. A decade later, Captain Scott led the Discovery expedition to Antarctica. Despite extensive planning, the crew began to show signs of scurvy during their second winter. The cause was a combination of overcooked rations and the long absence of fresh provisions. Scott's surgeon, Reginald Koetlitz, managed to reverse the symptoms by distributing fresh seal meat. It was an echo of what Arctic whalers had learned decades before, that raw or lightly cooked animal flesh could provide the missing nutrient. Even so, Scott's experiences did not fully eliminate uncertainty. When he returned to Antarctica in 1910 for the ill-fated Terra Nova expedition, scurvy remained a threat, compounded by exhaustion and cold. At the same time, Roald Amundsen prepared his rival expedition. Having studied the failures of others, he adopted a pragmatic approach: fresh seal and penguin meat, minimal cooking, and careful preservation of any supplies that might degrade. His team reached the South Pole in 1911, their health intact. Shackleton's Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition of 1914 became another proving ground for the lessons of scurvy. When the Endurance was trapped and crushed by ice, the crew survived for months on floes and in lifeboats, subsisting largely on seal and penguin. Though they suffered hunger and frostbite, scurvy never fully took hold. By then, the evidence was undeniable. Vitamin C, though the name was not yet widely known, was present in fresh, uncooked food. Still, the polar expeditions highlighted a deeper truth. Knowledge alone was not enough. To survive in the most hostile environments, explorers needed discipline, flexibility, and the humility to adapt to the practices of those who had lived on the margins for centuries. Imagine the contrast: an Edwardian gentleman, trained in the latest science, forced by necessity to gnaw raw seal liver, an act that once would have seemed primitive. Yet it was precisely this willingness that saved lives. As reports from these expeditions returned to Europe, they contributed to the final dismantling of old myths. No longer could anyone claim that scurvy was caused by putrid air or melancholy. The disease had been mapped to a deficiency as precise as any mechanical failure. The polar chapters of the scurvy story were not only about suffering, they were about the triumph of accumulated wisdom, how the insights of sailors, indigenous hunters, and scientists finally converged. In later decades, when vitamin C was isolated and synthesized, polar explorers became some of its first advocates. Shackleton himself praised the inclusion of fresh meat and citrus in any survival plan. And so, even in the last blank spaces on the map, the centuries-long battle against scurvy reached its conclusion, not with fanfare, but with the quiet knowledge that a simple practice could mean the difference between life and death. Chapter 13: The Birth of Vitamin Science. By the early 20th century, the pattern was unmistakable. Wherever fresh produce disappeared, scurvy reappeared. Wherever citrus or uncooked meat returned to the diet, the disease vanished. Still, the mechanism remained obscure. The word vitamin had not yet entered common language. Instead, researchers spoke of accessory food factors, mysterious compounds present in small quantities, yet essential to life. It was around 1907 that two Norwegian scientists, Axel Holst and Theodor Frolic, began systematic experiments. Their laboratory was far removed from any naval deck or Arctic camp. It was a university in Oslo. Yet what they discovered would finally put the last pieces in place. Holst and Frolic chose guinea pigs for their research, reasoning, correctly, though they did not yet know why, that these animals, like humans, could not synthesize vitamin C. When the animals were fed only grains and preserved foods, they developed bleeding gums, bruises, and weakness. When given fresh cabbage or lemon juice, they recovered. The experiment was clear, repeatable, and decisive. It demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that scurvy came from a deficiency, not from spoiled food or poor ventilation. But naming this essential substance took longer. Researchers across Europe and America began isolating compounds from food, searching for the factor responsible for resilience against disease. In 1912, the Polish chemist Casimir Funk proposed the word vitamine, combining vital and amine, because he believed the substances belonged to a specific chemical group. Though later refinements showed not all vitamins were amines, the term stuck. Over the next 2 decades, vitamins A, B, C, and D were slowly identified and characterized. Each discovery unfolded like the solving of a centuries-old riddle. It was Hungarian-born chemist Albert Sinch-Gyorgy who finally isolated the scurvy-preventing factor itself. Working in the 1920s and early 1930s, he extracted it first from adrenal glands, then from paprika and citrus. He called it hexuronic acid, later renamed ascorbic acid, from the Latin a, without, and scorbutus, scurvy. In 1932, Charles Glenn King and Sinch-Gyorgy independently confirmed that ascorbic acid was the elusive vitamin C. For the first time, the compound could be produced in pure form, measured and administered in precise doses. Imagine the vindication felt by generations of naval surgeons and ship captains. What they had learned through observation was finally understood in molecular detail. The practical applications were immediate. Food manufacturers began enriching products with vitamin C. Governments launched public health campaigns, teaching families to preserve fresh produce and avoid overcooking. During World War II, Britain invested heavily in distributing vitamin C to civilians under rationing. Though supplies of citrus were limited by the conflict, homegrown vegetables and synthetic supplements filled the gap. The long journey from vague superstition to laboratory certainty had come to an end. But even as the chemistry was settled, the old lessons remained. Knowledge alone was never enough. It had always required systems of trade, discipline aboard ships, and the political will to supply and enforce better diets. In this way, the story of scurvy became an emblem of modern nutrition itself, a reminder that the smallest molecules could change the fate of nations, and that progress often began with the simplest acts, like sharing a cup of lemon juice on a rolling deck. By mid-century, textbooks treated scurvy as a solved problem. What had once seemed a punishment from the sea gods was now a matter of missing molecules, predictable, preventable, and no longer a mystery. Chapter 14. The Legacy of the Lemon. As scurvy faded from living memory, it became something almost quaint, a disease of history books and cautionary tales, no longer the terror it once inspired. Yet the legacy of citrus rations left lasting marks far beyond the prevention of disease. For the Royal Navy, the adoption of lemon and lime juice had reshaped not just health, but discipline itself. Once sailors learned that their officers could spare them months of agony with a daily ration, expectations shifted. Commanders could no longer claim scurvy as an inevitable hazard. They had to prove their competence by preventing it. In the merchant fleets, the same transformation took longer. But by the late 19th century, no reputable shipping line would send men to sea without a plan for fresh provisions. Sailors' unions, newly organized, demanded clear policies on diet as part of their contracts. The fight against scurvy had helped establish the idea that employers bore responsibility for the welfare of those in their care. In civilian life, the lesson spread too. Public health campaigns began to stress the importance of fresh produce, not just for sailors, but for everyone. By the early 20th century, Britain was importing vast quantities of oranges from Spain and lemons from Sicily. Working families began to see citrus not as a luxury but as an essential part of everyday meals. Schools incorporated nutrition into their lessons. Posters in railway stations and town halls reminded citizens to eat fresh fruit, protect your health. Even the term limey, once a naval nickname, entered popular language as a symbol of British practicality. International trade felt the impact. Plantations in the Caribbean and the Mediterranean expanded production to meet the demands of navies and merchant companies. Entire economies grew around the business of preventing scurvy, from cooperages crafting barrels to chemists refining concentrate. Meanwhile, the scientific community continued to explore the frontiers that the citrus story had opened. If vitamin C could be so decisive, what other micronutrients were hidden in the foods people took for granted? frontiers were hidden in the foods people took for granted. Research into vitamins A, B, D, and K all drew inspiration, in part, from the solution to scurvy. Imagine a classroom in 1930s London. Children gathered around a teacher holding a lemon aloft, explaining how something so small could save a life. The lesson was both practical and moral. Ignorance could kill, but curiosity and care could save. Even in remote corners of the world, the story retained its power. Polar explorers still planned their rations with the memory of Franklin's vanished crews. Submariners and aviators studied case histories of scurvy, determined never to repeat old mistakes. During World War II, the British Ministry of Food developed strategies to ensure that vitamin C remained available despite the German blockade. Scientists found ways to extract ascorbic acid from rose hips, a wild plant that grew abundantly in hedgerows. Civilians were encouraged to forage and preserve the bright red fruit, and millions of jars of rosehip syrup were distributed to children. This was not merely nostalgia for empire. It was a recognition that, even in an industrial age, human health remained rooted in the simplest natural compounds. As decades passed, scurvy all but disappeared in developed nations. Doctors encountered it only rarely, the extremely poor, or isolated communities. Its reappearance was always treated as an indictment, proof that somewhere systems had failed. Yet the story endures, retold in lectures and documentaries. It offers an enduring lesson about the interplay of observation, experiment, and compassion. No single hero discovered the cure. Instead, generations of sailors, physicians, and scientists each contributed a piece, their insights accumulating into a legacy of prevention. And so, in the memory of the lemon, unremarkable, commonplace, lay one of humanity's quietest triumphs: the understanding that even the mightiest fleets were ultimately at the mercy of a few missing molecules. Chapter 15. A cautionary tale. Remembered by the mid-20th century, scurvy had become a curiosity, a relic of an age when ships crossed the world with no guarantee their crews would survive. Yet, in medical schools, naval academies, and history classrooms, the tale remained compulsory learning. Professors would remind their students that every epidemic of scurvy had once seemed inevitable. Again and again, generations accepted its toll as the price of exploration. And each time, the answer had been within reach, waiting for someone to look closer. It was not only a story about ships or sailors. It was about how knowledge moves, slowly, fitfully, from experience to explanation, about how prejudice and habit can blind even the most disciplined minds, and about how, sometimes, solutions come not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through steady observation and quiet conviction. Imagine the first naval surgeons, doubted by their own captains, measuring out lemon juice by the ounce. Imagine the ordinary seamen, uncertain whether the daily ration mattered, lifting a tin cup to their lips. Imagine the explorers, starving at the ends of the earth, forced to abandon old customs and trust in the wisdom of other cultures. Each of these moments was small. None felt like history, yet together they shifted the fate of millions. In the decades after vitamin C was isolated, other nutrient deficiencies began to yield their secrets: pellagra, beriberi, rickets. One by one, the diseases of privation were mapped to specific chemical lacks. New generations of scientists honored the example of the scurvy story by pursuing similar questions. What unseen elements sustain us? What are the hidden debts our bodies pay in hardship? By the 1950s, even in the most remote voyages, scurvy had been rendered avoidable. Submarines carried synthetic vitamin C in sealed tins. Antarctic research stations planted greenhouses to grow fresh greens in polar darkness. Hospitals established protocols to identify and treat deficiency before symptoms advanced. Yet, the caution remained. In every discussion of long-duration spaceflight, nutritionists invoked the old lessons. No matter how advanced the machinery, no matter how sophisticated the technology, the human body still requires the same ancient molecules. And so, the lemon, once a simple fruit traded in Mediterranean ports, became a symbol of how far knowledge could travel and how easily it could be lost. In maritime museums today, visitors can see preserved casks labeled lime juice naval issue. Children peer into glass cases holding the artifacts of survival: iron ration tins, tiny scales, surgeons' handwritten logs. The displays commemorate not only triumph, but also the many failures that taught their generation to do better. Historians still debate exactly when scurvy was finally defeated. Some point to Lynn's first trials, others to the Admiralty's decrees, still others to the moment when vitamin C was crystallized in a laboratory. But perhaps no single date matters more than the fact that each step built on the last. It is easy in retrospect to mock the old theories of bad air and black bile, but those ideas were not stupidity. They were guesses in the absence of evidence. And over time, as the guesses failed, new experiments rose to replace them. That, ultimately, is the moral of the scurvy story. Knowledge advances because someone dares to ask why suffering happens and refuses to accept the easy answer. Today, scurvy is nearly invisible in wealthy nations, yet it persists in pockets of extreme poverty and neglect. A reminder that progress is never guaranteed to reach everyone. Medical journals still occasionally publish case reports of isolated patients who slip through the cracks. In each of those stories, the echo of the old voyages returns. The body, deprived of its essential molecules, surrenders, slowly, inexorably, to the same ancient enemy. And the cure, as always, is astonishingly simple. Perhaps that is why this tale still matters. It teaches that no challenge, however vast, is beyond understanding if we are willing to look closely and test our assumptions. It also teaches humility. For all our technologies, we are bound by the same needs that govern the first sailors who set out in wooden ships, trusting in the power of something as small as a lemon. End of story. If you'd like, I can help you prepare a closing narration or any supporting material for your video.